So let's begin. Both of you are just back from Washington, where you attended APAC, the conference with thousands and thousands of other, I think we're 18,000 people. Every year they say it's the most ever, and this seemed to have been the most ever. People gathered for the annual policy conference of the pro-Israel lobby. So it seems natural to start by focusing on US relations in general before we really get to American Jewish ties with Israel in particular. So Dan, I want to take advantage. This is, I think, your first appearance in New York since you left your official post. And I want you to help us understand a little bit about what really was going on in the relationship between Israel and the United States under the Obama administration. Was it really as bad as Michael Oren suggested at one point that
that question can't be asked in a neutral way, right? It has to be.
President Obama was purposely distancing himself.
Right.
You know the question. We'd really like to hear what your insights are.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be relatively brief so we can get to the other subjects that we want to cover. Very brief thanks to the Jewish Week, to Hadassah, to Rabbi Cosgrove and Park Avenue Synagogue for hosting us tonight, and thanks everyone for coming. I, as will emerge, I think, in the course of our discussion, am somebody who spent my whole formative years and much of my professional life committed out of Zionist impulses and out of an understanding of what U.S. foreign policy interests are to strengthen the United States-Israel relationship, to ensure Israel's security, to help Israel achieve or at least pursue peace with its neighbors. I could never have done those things, or I could never have worked for an administration that was not committed to the same goals. Everybody who knows President Obama from his years in Chicago, when he was really quite close to the Jewish community, knows that's very much the same approach and the same value set that he brought to this relationship. There's ancient history, which I will not sift through, about narratives and about people trying to describe him in certain ways or interpret policies in certain ways. So I'll just make a couple of very brief points. One is that there was ever any desire or goal or strategic objective about distancing the United States from Israel. This is, it's wrong. I'll avoid other kinds of words to describe that, but it's incorrect. He was certainly, I think, proved his loyalty and his fidelity to the commitments that the United States has always had for Israel's security, to the many times he and Prime Minister Netanyahu met, his own travels to Israel. He proved that in many ways, and to me, this was something that is a kind of mythology that grew up around him going to Cairo to give a speech early on, and some known disagreements, which I'll get to in just a second, between our governments, which he didn't shy away from discussing, because his feeling was always this was a relationship of friends, strong partners, but mature partners who can actually openly discuss the things we disagree about. So what were the disagreements? They're very well known, and I don't want to rehash them at length, although if people want to get into them in the questions, we can. One, obviously, was the Iran agreement, which was vexing in a way because it derived from a common strategic objective of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and followed several years of very intense, very close, very high level, very sensitive coordination between us and the Israelis to build a sanctions regime that put pressure on Iran, to recruit others to participate in it, to build a military option, to really put the pressure on Iran so that they faced that choice of seeing their economy collapse or negotiating for a deal, always knowing that we might draw the line differently between a good agreement and a bad agreement. And indeed, when the negotiations finally did get serious, that happened. How that dispute was unfolded, and in a very public way, in a very political way, I think was unfortunate, but I don't think all it says is that we're two countries with very close overlapping interests, but not identical interests, and that it's natural that there might come a point when a large superpower with global responsibilities and a small power, regional power with its own capabilities but less, and obviously certain vulnerabilities, would draw that line differently about where the agreement was. The second, of course, was on the issue of settlements, and this was a West Bank settlement, which is a feature of our discussions between the United States and Israel throughout all 8 years, and the George Mitchell peace effort and the John Kerry peace effort. Nothing new there either, in a way, because every administration has had its disagreements and struggles with Israel over settlements, sometimes more public, sometimes less so. Again, these things had a way of folding into that narrative of distancing and I think at times In an unusual situation, Israeli politicians found it advantageous for the first time to position themselves in opposition to a U.S. president. And so sometimes these disagreements became more prolonged and more public and more strained than obviously any ambassador, I think, would like them to. We always try to solve problems quietly and in the negotiating rooms. So those things happened, and it even culminated in the UN Security Council resolution. Again, if people want to talk about it, I won't run away from it. But these were known disagreements, and they were present. At the same time that was happening, and this is the really important point, at the same time that was happening, all through those 8 years, in very tangible, very dramatic ways, the United States-Israel relationship got much, much stronger. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the security assistance, of course, which provides Israel everything it needs to defend itself by itself, and has now been upgraded with a $38 billion memorandum of understanding that was signed last year. Missile defense technologies that are really breaking all kinds of barriers and saving lives, Israeli lives and, by the way, Palestinian lives, by protecting Israel from rocket attacks and then from the follow-on effects of casualties from those rocket attacks. In intelligence cooperation, in training by our militaries, in the economic partnership between our countries, which has gone from about $35 billion to $50 billion trade relationship just in the 5 years I was there, 40% increase. All of those, and I can go on and on in detail, but I won't, derive from also decisions that those same two leaders, President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, made together. They sat in quiet, closed, sensitive discussions and made decisions and then directed their militaries and their diplomats and their economic czars and their intelligence agencies to implement that. So we didn't get stronger despite them, and despite the fact they had disagreements, we got stronger because of them. And so what I will be doing some writing about over the next period is to, I think, try to explain that while it is true we had disagreements, and disagreements that in a way are natural based on our different interests and our different positions in the world, we actually, the relationship was so strong that despite disagreements, even personal tensions at times, we managed to make the relationship stronger during the same period. And I think both of them, by the way, deserve more credit than they tend to get. And I hope as we recede from that period and we can look at it with more historical perspective and out of the daily media and political swirl, both of them will get more credit than they currently get for actually having strengthened the relationship despite the disagreements.
I'm sure we're going to get into some of those issues a little bit more as we move on, but I just want to ask you one question now that we've switched to a new administration. And again, you have actually been very outspoken and writing already a lot in Foreign Policy and other publications, even suggesting that it would be a good idea perhaps to move the embassy to Jerusalem if it was done right. The Jewish people who supported President Trump, I think were expecting something from him. At this point, it's really not clear where that is going. Some of his envoys who have gone, some of his statements that he's made, some suggest that maybe there won't be quite as big a change. At the same time, the Israeli ambassador to the United States in Washington in the last couple of days made some comment about how there has never been such little daylight between Israel and Jerusalem. So from your perspective, what do you think President Trump might be pursuing, and what do you think might be likely to change?
Right. So obviously I don't speak for the Trump administration. So I'm an analyst as I make these remarks. But I do think something very interesting happened between the campaign and the inauguration and into the early days of the administration. And I experienced this in Israel. You know, during the election result was a little bit of a surprise. I don't think it was a bigger surprise to anybody than the guy who won. And people in Israel reacted accordingly. The strong proponents of settlement construction, the strong right-wing elements in the government who are opponents of a two-state solution, got very excited. And there was a lot of hooping and hollering about how now a two-state solution can be put away in the dustbin of history. Now we can build anywhere we want. Now we can be an annexation of the West Bank. Now we can even legalize illegal settlements on Palestinian land, and there was legislation advancing in the Knesset to do that. All this while President Obama was still president. But there was that expectation based on statements, based on advisors, based on various things. Well, an interesting thing happened between the election and Inauguration Day is that I think the president and his advisors, again, I can't speak for them, and I really don't know them, started to talk to some other people. They started to talk to some of the Arab partners. In the very early days of the administration, King Abdullah of Jordan made an unscheduled visit to Washington for the National Prayer Breakfast. Didn't have a meeting with the president, got one anyway. I think he was very shrewd and very influential and some other communications as well, and helping them start to think about the implications of some of the policies that had been associated with their campaign statements. If the embassy is moved right away, if you say, actually, settlement construction is not an issue that we're concerned about. If you actually say, look, two-state solution is not something that we're going to drive for. If the parties want it, that's fine, but it's not what we're interested in. And at the same time, you're trying to build partnerships with Arab governments to tackle Iran, to tackle ISIS, even to recruit them to participate in a regional process that might ultimately improve the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. Those don't quite fit together. And so what's happened in the first 2 months of the administration, and with now several rounds of negotiations and a visit by an envoy, Jason Greenblatt, to Israel, is some of the same issues have recurred. I don't want to say it's exactly the Obama policy, but it's not that different. Clearly, there is a discussion about a regional process, something we also pursued toward, there's using words like lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I don't think there's a version of that other than a two-state solution, even if they dance around that exact language because of the Prime Minister's political sensitivities. They are articulating a view on settlements very similar to the ones that not just the Obama administration, every previous administration did, which was that if it's already there on the ground, it's something to be negotiated, and you can do land swaps, there's ways of accommodating them, but additional construction changes the map, spoils the political environment, and it's not helpful, at least not helpful to our interests and what we think of as the way we help Israel achieve interests. So this says to me that, and by the way, I'll put my cards on the table. I have a lot of very deep concerns about this administration on many issues, on many foreign issues and on many domestic issues. I won't detail them. It's not my cup of tea. On this one issue, I would say they're much more within the mainstream of U.S. policy than almost anything else I can think of. And that says to me that these were not ideological hobby horses of the Obama administration or previous administrations. These are fairly durable structural U.S. interests that kind of any administration that approaches them from the question of how can we have the relationships we want with the various partners we have in the Middle East, including, of course, our first and best partner, Israel, but also Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states. How can we tackle the threats of Iran, ISIS, other instabilities? You get drawn back to a very similar set of policies, and I think that's happened time and again, and may indeed be happening in this most unusual of administrations.
Against this backdrop, Rabbi Cosgrove, in a powerful Rosh Hashanah sermon last year that you adapted for an article for the Jewish Week, you called for a new chapter of American Zionism, noting that the conflict facing American Jewry regarding Israel needs to be addressed, lest, as you put it, the critical bond between the two vital centers of world Jewry will be imperiled. Very strong words. Will you please describe for us what this conflict is, what your old definition of Zionism was, and why you think it's so critical that we have a new definition of American Zionism?
Of course, and likewise, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and the ambassador, and Hadassah, and Jewish Week, and all of my favorite organizations, none more favorite than Park Avenue Synagogue. So thank you so much. Look, not only 100 years since Balfour, but Balfour, by a certain telling, came by way of Brandeis. Brandeis, who solved or proposed a way to address the issue of dual loyalty. Then, in that moment of time, the founding of American Zionism, as it were, the first chapter, perhaps, that one can be a strong Zionist and one can be a strong American all at the same time. And in every generation since, there have been different incarnations of the story of American Zionism, the founding of the state, the '67 war, and otherwise. And we've arrived at a point now where, in that article that you're referencing, but it's really just come to be more and more acute in the months since the high holidays. Not my language, it's a sociologist, Stephen Cohen, who talked about the prophetic and the protective impulse that within us as a Jewish community, on the one hand, the prophetic values, our commitments to universal values, all of humanity, the social ideals that we teach and preach and hopefully live. But then there's also these sort of very traditional and important values of taking care of our own and worried about issues of Jewish vulnerability, what I'll term shorthand the protective impulses. And and these have come to be oftentimes in conflict, one with the other. I'll just leverage off of Dan's okay? Leverage off of Dan's, right? I was just at APAC too. And I was sitting there, I don't have as good of a seat as Dan does at the at APAC, but so I went with my daughter. And I'm sitting there next to my daughter, and every single speaker is decrying the slander against the state of Israel that in public forums in the UN and otherwise of Israel as an apartheid state. Okay, and that's just, if you were at APAC, you know that this was sort of the talking point on the script. And my daughter leans over to me and says, wait a second, if there are Palestinians living under Israeli rule and they're not allowed to vote, then at what point is Israel becoming an apartheid state? Isn't that, and she's, I see her squirming with certain questions. My daughter or outside when we walked in, there's an organization. I actually don't know much about the organization other than its name, which is If Not Now, Imlo Achshav, riffing off of the Hebrew, and it's asking, if not now, if we don't make moves now for a two-state solution, then at what point will there be so many facts on the ground that will become an impossibility or a very, very painful one? And so I see these questions percolating in my own family, in my own community, and in American Jewry as well. And we're just arrived at a point where it could be, I don't know, what other example could I give you? The biggest applause at the APAC conference came for Nikki Haley, at the UN ambassador, and she gave an impassioned speech about, never again will America stab Israel in the back, right? I mean, she just really laid in to your administration. And no, it's on live.
Everybody knows what it means.
Everyone knows what it means, and whether it's a UN resolution, from the Cairo speech to the Iran deal to the UN resolution, that the Obama administration was characterized as a betrayal of the American-Israel relationship and the American Jewish community. And then on the other side, you had, I think it was a piece Thomas Friedman had a few months ago, this notion of friends don't let friends drive drunk. And at what point is it incumbent upon American Jewry to act in a way that they feel they are acting in Israel's best interest, even when the Israeli administration is not taking steps to actualize what's in its own best interest, right? A friend letting a friend drive drunk. And so I think, and there are a million other examples, personal, otherwise, and I think that we're sort of caught betwixt and between these prophetic and protective values, right? Another way, just as you were speaking, we have multiple expressions of what it means to be a Zionist. One could tell the tale of this moment as a difference between having Dan Shapiro as your ambassador to Israel and having David Friedman as your ambassador to Israel, right? They represent two great American Jewish stories and two totally different visions of what it means to be a Zionist right now. And both feel that they are acting on behalf of Israel's best interest. So where do we go from here? That's a question. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How can I explain to my daughter, right, that there's a fundamental need for a state of Israel, that Israel is not an apartheid state, that Israel is a nation whose Arab neighbors have never acknowledged Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, that there are fundamental differences between where Israel is and otherwise, but also know that it's not only the stated policy of Israel and the stated policy of America, but it's actually in the best interests of the future of the Jewish state to be to have a two-state solution. And them advocating for that is, sorry for the double negative, not only not a betrayal of their Zionism, but actually an actualization in the finest way of their Zionism.
Dan, I want you to respond to that, but one of the things that I find so interesting that you're bringing up is the political nature of Zionism. I mean, it used to be you could be a Zionist and it didn't really matter what your politics were, what you thought in terms of political areas in the United States or policies in Israel. But now what you're suggesting is really all about your political viewpoint. Is there any way to separate politics from Zionism, or is that what it's all about now?
It's getting more complicated, right, because of this prophetic and protective, right? What do we do when the Trump administration has come out so fervently in support of Israel, against the Iran deal, right, checking all the boxes of what it means to be a Verbrennte Zionist. But at the same time, whether it's associations with the alt-right or other issues which are of classical Jewish concern, refugees and otherwise, when you see your political views coming and clashing one with the other, and it's not easier on the other side. Another protesting group outside of AIPAC was, I don't remember the exact chant, but it basically was, "Hey ho, all the walls have got to go," meaning if you don't like Trump's policy about the wall with Mexico, then how can you like the policy regarding regarding Netanyahu and Israel and a security fence, right? And this has happened in Ferguson. This has happened in other progressive liberal causes, that there's been this sort of jumbling up where it's hard to be, and I wrote this in another piece in the Jewish Week, both a liberal in terms of my progressive causes and a Zionist all at the same time.
I want to explore that a little bit more, but I want your sense of this. Is there a way to divorce politics from Zionism?
These days, I suspect there's not. And I think nobody has a monopoly on what it means to be a Zionist. Nobody has a monopoly on how to express that support for the state of Israel. But when I say nobody has a monopoly on it, means, people who express it through a political tradition that probably you and I share, and that I certainly identify with, as Rabbi Cosgrove wrote about it, shouldn't feel the least bit sheepish or embarrassed or apologetic, or that there's any conflict. And I think you've tried to capture this, that it is not just possible, it's definitionally appropriate to have liberal values and Zionist values intersect very closely with one another. Of course, the establishment of the State of Israel, the fulfillment of that century's dream, and that actualization of self-determination for the Jewish people, something I think that unites Zionists, whatever their politics are, and the sense of humility that you wrote about, that we have to realize that there are major risks and threats, and we Zionists in the diaspora don't experience them the same way Israelis do, who have to live with them and defend against them in their own way. And that sort of impulse of protection, which is articulated by American politicians too, and I'm very happy. And there isn't a significant difference between this administration's policy on protecting Israel at the UN, or on standing up for Israel in other international forums, or its legitimacy. This is also of longstanding, and thankfully so. I've worked very hard to ensure that's the case. There are other voices creeping into the debate in our party, and we can maybe talk about that. But that protective impulse, I think, is critically important. But the same impulse of ensuring that this miracle, this gift, this jewel that we in our day and age, after the centuries of exile, get to experience, which is a sovereign state of Israel, state of the Jewish people, in the historic homeland of the Jewish people, and that same impulse of protecting it and not seeing it lost, I think, lies behind what we'll call liberal Zionists, for lack of a better term, bring to the table when they say, if we don't help Israel, if the United States does not help Israel, if we as a diaspora Jewish community don't help Israel take those hard decisions, recognizing there's nothing that absolves Palestinians about their responsibilities, and they have not been a reliable partner, and they have difficulty making the decisions they must make, and the region is a mess, and it's unstable, and that poses risks. But that at least we want to work with our Israeli partners to make sure that the two-state solution, which will preserve a Jewish and democratic state, and it's the only way most people can understand to preserve a Jewish and democratic state, that at least it's kept alive. At least they continue to search for it. At least they don't do things that make it harder to get there later, perhaps when the circumstances are better. That to me is a very Zionist thing, a very Zionist position to take. It fuses, in my judgment, Zionist and liberal values, but in a way that I think is quite responsible, and it's of course shared by many Israelis. I mean, there's no reason why American Zionists who believe that that's the way you protect the future of Israel, the Jewish democratic state, should feel sheepish about it, when a significant number, and it varies from poll to poll, and it fluctuates from election to election, Israelis also see that as a critical part of the future. One last point on this. You know, the question your daughter is asking, Elliot, which is a critical one. What happens if just the flow of history, perhaps because of the lack of a partner, perhaps because of decisions by the Israeli leadership, some combination of those, leads to something we call one state? What's it going to look like? You know, it used to be that when people would start talking about a one-state solution, you knew you were talking to an anti-Zionist. You knew you were. Even still, in the BDS movement, you have people say, let's just give everybody the vote. And we kind of know what that means. Or they say, well, we'll have a two-state solution, and then we'll have the full right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants, and we'll overwhelm Israel demographically, and then again, you don't have a Jewish state. So you used to have that experience of, you heard one state, and you'd get very defensive on behalf of Israel. What? You're trying to destroy the one and only Jewish state of Israel. Now we have this very odd experience where the most vocal advocates of, let's say, settlement expansion are members of the Israeli cabinet, and many of them are my friends, by the way, and I value those friendships, but they're also openly opposed to a two-state solution, and they say so. And they even say that one of the impacts of expanding settlements, they hope, will be to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. So that's a very strange turn of the wheel, that what used to be a threat, and I still believe and understand it to be a threat to the vision of the Zionist vision of a Jewish and democratic state of Israel, is what at least one side of the debate now starts to hold up as the goal.
And the toxicity of the discourse doesn't help.
No.
Right? The idea that if one that one Zionism can be questioned if one stands up and advocates for a two-state solution or otherwise, that one can be held to account. Whereas in Israel, there's not necessarily a conflict. One can be liberal, one can be Zionist, right? But here in the States, we suffer from a polarization of these viewpoints, which, back to your question, Lisa, is why I think it's so important that people of varying shades, right? No one has the solution here, but that we can't. Those who occupy what I call the sane center can't abdicate our voice to the much louder voices on either side. That if we've never talked. I don't know if your politics are in line, but we can sit next to each other, right? And I think that we might be in deep trouble if we just say, oh, they're louder, they care more, right? It's actually, there's no greater way that you can express your care for Israel than making the conversation a sane one.
You know, Dan, it's interesting that we're having this conversation. In doing a little research, I found that you were quoted in a recent JTA article suggesting perhaps that it was not quite appropriate for American Jews to be articulating opposition to Israeli policy. So tell me if you were maybe misquoted, or maybe maybe I misinterpreted it. But you said, as a concerned and patriotic American citizen, I think I have every right and every responsibility to say what I think and offer my best, hopefully constructive commentary and analysis about my own government. And that means there will be times that it will include criticism. I try to maintain a more analytical approach to policy questions from the point of view of the Israeli government. You know I remain a guest in this country, and I think that's an appropriate way for me to conduct my activities at this stage. Now, perhaps what you're saying is while you're still in Israel, you shouldn't be as an American Jew, but maybe when you come back here, you're okay? Is that what you're saying?
That was a very specific comment about me and my role as a former ambassador,
I see. Okay.
a recently former ambassador, still living in country. It's an unusual situation.
Okay.
I acknowledge it's unusual. I've already actually been able to speak to Mr. Friedman and assure him that I have no intention of creating problems for him or in trying to inhabit his turf or being a player in Israeli politics. I do intend to be an analyst. I do intend to be a commentator. And over time, I'll probably reemerge more in Israel. But for now, my market is the U.S. market. But that was very specific to that unusual circumstance of a former ambassador staying in country. I feel strongly, as Elliot described it, that it's a legitimate, and I would say it's more than a legitimate. It's kind of an imperative for anyone who loves Israel and cares about its future and cares about what animates the relationship between the United States Jewish community and Israel, this diaspora-Israel relationship, but also the United States and Israel, as I think about it more in a foreign policy practitioner's mindset, that we be open as friends. My experience with Israelis has taught me one thing. If you clear the bar of demonstrating, number one, that you care, and if you're Jewish, it helps that you identify with Israel and its story and its history, and that you understand the dilemmas and the insecurities that Israelis live with on a daily basis, those who send their children to the army, those who know that literally on every border, every single border, there is somebody who actually wants to hurt them, kill them, destroy them. That's true, and trying to achieve the means and acquire the technologies to do so. If you can demonstrate you have that understanding and you recognize that's the reality in which they live, you can have some very tough conversations. And it's understood as a conversation within the family, as Israelis have with each other. We all know the experience of Israelis, having an argument across a coffee shop table or around the Shabbat dinner table, and you think they're going to get up and strike each other, and they get up and they hug each other. And that's the way Israelis talk politics to each other. I don't think it's impossible for American Jews and Israelis to have the same kind of in-the-family debates, as long as it's under the umbrella of care and identification and understanding of what they live with.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to your quest for a new chapter. I mean, the reality is that this uncivil discourse, polarization among American Jews, it's not new. It really started back in the Lebanon War in the 80s, and it's gone up and down in different cycles depending on who's in power in the United States, who's in power in Israel. But how do we achieve this? I mean, I think there's always been this sense that it's terrible that Jews can't talk to each other and fight with each other to such a degree. But how do we get to a point where there's a new conversation?
Look, I'm not saying this just because you're with Hadassah, but I think a conversation just like this one is a heck of a good way to begin, meaning to create a space where people can come in civilly. I have no idea what people's politics are in the room, but we can all sit down, we all care and are invested in Israel's future, and we can work together in all of the diversity of our views towards forwarding Israel's place on the world stage as a safe and secure Jewish state. I think Zionist education is critical here, no different than any. And my wife is in here, so I'm going to get in trouble for what I'm going to say. But I think when I tell my children the story of our courtship, right? I begin by at a certain age I layer in one set of the story. At another age, I layer in another part of the story when they're ready to have that, right? But first, I make sure they know that mommy and daddy love each other very, very much, right? And so I think that there should be I'm an educator. I think there needs to be a full force, full court press from organizations like Hadassah and otherwise, that at every level, Hebrew school kids, day school kids, and otherwise, the questions that my daughter was asking me, they need to have working answers all the way up through until they are on their way to college and prepared with the narrative and the right of Jewish self-determination in their own land. And I think we're woefully under-preparing American kids for that right now. I think that would be a great first step in addressing this.
Well, I'll add to what you've written about in terms of the educational imperatives: Jewish history, Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, Zionist history, all of the above. I'd add Hebrew language. I'm sure you would agree, and I don't remember if it was in the article, but it's such a critical tool to make those connections between our past and our present and the modern flourishing of Hebrew culture in Israeli society, and then to connect with Israelis in their language. I mean, one of the things I tried to do as ambassador, but I preached the same thing to every American Jewish Federation or synagogue group that I spoke with while I was there, is that we tend to, very naturally, it's nothing nefarious about it, we tend to go to the usual suspects. By the way, I love the usual suspects. They're my friends. They're the people we know best, who come to the United States most often. They speak the best English. They tend to live in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. They tend to be educated in Western institutions. There's many Israelis who don't fit that description, and it's much harder for typical American Jews to get to know them and to go see them in their development towns, in their moshavs, in their Haredi communities, in their Arab towns, in their settlements. And I actually think that's something that that a Hebrew facility helps create those opportunities, rethinking how we have these engagements between American Jews, particularly younger Jews, and their Israeli counterparts, I think can help us branch out. And the Israeli side has the same obligation, by the way. The Ruderman Family Foundation has done some wonderful work trying to help build a cohort of experts on American Jewry among Israelis. Because Israelis tend to be almost as ignorant about American Jews as sometimes we feel we are about them. So they are bringing Knesset members and journalists, thought leaders over and visiting communities around the country. They've established a master's degree program at the University of Haifa in American Jewish Community Studies to develop that cohort of expertise. So there's a lot more we can do to get to know each other and have that conversation not just be between American Jews of one political opinion or another, but between American Jews of all political opinions and Israelis of all backgrounds and all opinions.
Absolutely.
I think I'd just be remiss if at some point, and maybe this was your next question, Lisa, but if we didn't add the issue of religious pluralism to this conversation, because this is a conservative synagogue. There are people from all sorts of synagogues or no synagogues here, but I think this question of to what degree do Israelis and American Jewry, how can we speak to each other? On the one hand, and the degree to which American Jewry may or may not be critical of Israel. There have been several occasions in the Netanyahu administration, but also in administrations beforehand, when Israel would presume to speak on behalf of American Jewry and know what's in the best interests of American Jewry. But at the same time and again, we are seeing that the Jewry that is practiced here in North America is not validated, whether it's conversion or funding of non-Orthodox religious institutions in Israel, or the Kotel, or the Mikvaot, or any number of issues where Israel continues to send the message that the Judaism that I'm going to bet 90% of everyone in this room is not considered authentic Judaism. So how, on the one hand, can you ask for our blank check, but at the same time push us away with the other hand? And I think that needs to be figured out too.
By the way, I would tend to tell Israeli political leaders when these issues would come up, and I didn't feel that I had a U.S. foreign policy hook to go in and argue with them about the Kotel. We monitored it, we reported on it, but we didn't have a policy position about what the outcome of that should be. But I did say to them, look, I'll speak to you as the American ambassador in broader terms. The support that the U.S. Jewish community has provided to Israel through the decades is a critical pillar. It's not the only pillar, thankfully, but it's a critical pillar of the United States policy that we have seen consistently support Israel through the decades. And to the extent that American Jews in the next generation or even the current generation start to feel that sense of alienation, that has strategic implications. That may have even geopolitical implications. And so one should think about it. If you can't get yourself there on identification with a different stream of Judaism, as many Israelis, not because it's hostile, just because it's foreign, they don't get it, they're raised in a different tradition, and this reform conservative thing just doesn't speak to them, as well as the ones who are more overtly hostile to it. Then maybe I could get them to understand that strategic value of finding a way to bridge those gaps.
Right. And when I had the honor of this past December, just as a UN vote was taking place, I spoke at the Knesset on this very issue. I said that not more than, but in addition to understanding that moment, right, the split between the American administration and the Israeli administrations on the issue of the UN resolution, it wasn't just about the personalities or the politics or particulars of that perhaps, God forbid, in future generations, people will look back on that moment and also look at it as a moment of American Jewry flinching on its relationship with Israel. And to this question of policy implications of not recognizing American Jewry for who we are.
You know, and I think you're right also about the fact that Israelis don't get it. And it shows the divide between how Israelis look at the religious pluralism issue and American Jews. I mean, there's no question the Kotel issue, and of course we're talking about the agreement that Natan Sharansky reached over a year ago to try to implement the development of an egalitarian section at the Kotel, and it has not been implemented because of government forces, and a lot of outrage in the United States and among American Jewry. Interestingly, I was at a conference in Jerusalem with the Jewish media from all over the world, and also around the world. They didn't care. I mean, there were journalists from France and from Russia had other issues that were much more pressing, but for the American Jewish journalists there, it was a very big issue. But clearly the Israelis don't appreciate it the same way. And so in the same way that just that quest of kind of connecting and educating each other, and you're absolutely right about the Israelis need to come here. I mean, they've also been doing that for many, many years, but there still needs to be more of a push for that. Absolutely. Let's go back to one of the things you were talking about before in terms of being involved in liberal left circles. I mean, I think one of the really troubling things, many troubling things in recent weeks and recent months, but one in particular is this idea that if you're a feminist and a Zionist, it's incompatible. Probably most of you are aware that one of the women who was very prominent in the Women's March that was so big in Washington, and then in the women's strike a couple weeks ago, very, very emphatically came out with a piece saying Zionism and feminism are incompatible. And I know at Hadassah that was something that there was a lot of concern about, and I'm sure in a lot of other circles. How do liberal Jews get involved in that, or the Black Lives Matter, which is a concern among many people?
I'm of mixed opinion. Number one, I'm sad. But the question is, you can only be sad for so long, then you got to actually do something about it. And so, on the one hand, I could say I'm not getting involved in Ferguson or Women's March or Black Lives, all these liberal causes, because I know that some of the people there have their views when it comes to Israel are let's just say, are not my own. On the other hand, the chutzpan, the nudnik in me thinks, sorry to use, davka, I should go to those things, that I should go to the Women's March. I was picking up one of my kids at the airport, and I saw the marches on, and this is just a new chant. It's all chances from Palestine to Mexico. All the walls have got to go. And I was saying, I would have been standing there with you guys, but you lost me when you conflated one issue with the other. And I said, maybe I should be there. Wearing some big, I might get beat up, but I with a big, waving a flag and saying I'm a proud supporter of Israel, and I'm also proudly on the liberal side of whatever the issue is. Because if I don't do that, then I don't see how we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole, right? Just because I disagree, right? This is just coalition politics or otherwise. Just because, we might disagree on 10 different issues doesn't mean that you and I can't work together on this one issue. And I think that needs to be our tactic moving forward.
I think I agree with that, it's no point in ceding ground on issues that we do agree with because of those disagreements. Now, we have to do the education. And I think sometimes what has happened, obviously there are people with strongly held ideological views, but I think sometimes we as a community have just been maybe slow to the mark to make our case to our, let's say, liberal allies in some of these other causes, and they've been co-opted by somebody else who came with a different agenda. And had we been there, we might have been able to at least stabilize that ground, or at least keep those other voices more at the margins. The difficulty I realize, especially on campuses, is that young people, maybe not with the full education equipment they need, but even when they have it, are really put in a very, very challenging situation. They're there to study, they're there to have an education, they're there to do some other things, but they're then kind of thrust out there to be the shield and the defenders of Israel and the Jewish people and the legitimacy of Zionism within that context of those somewhat hostile, sometimes hostile liberal voices. That's a lot. That's a big burden for a young person to carry. But again, I think they, and all of us have that responsibility to not cede the ground, but to make our case and maintain the allies we can within those movements.
Right. And someone who writes very well on this issue is Bret Stephens, because he has a riff.
Not a liberal.
Not a liberal, but he says, you find me. He says to your college student, would-be college, you care about women's rights, you care about LGBT rights, you care about equality, all of the, now go find me one other place in the Middle East, perhaps a world, which is as strong on these issues as Israel is. So I think it's putting the tools, educating not just our kids, but giving them the tools to educate others.
There's a lot to celebrate there. We marched every year in the Gay Pride Parade in Tel Aviv, 200,000 people, an incredible event. It also happens in Jerusalem. It's happened with tragedy in Jerusalem. But Israel is far advanced for many societies. They're not perfect. They've got ways to go on all these issues. Got news for everybody. We're not perfect either. And we're maybe even taking a bit of a detour on some of these questions. So I think we should have that sense of humility. But there's plenty to celebrate. And I never understood this idea, this concept of pinkwashing. I know it is sometimes raised in this context, that if you are celebrating and giving credit where it's due to those aspects of Israeli society that do represent those liberal values, somehow it is cuts against whatever commitment you have to the other aspects of trying to achieve justice between Israelis and Palestinians.
Here's another controversial issue that came up recently I'd like your take on. The Israeli government passed legislation recently to bar any foreigners who support boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And a lot of American Jews took issue with that. So what's your take on that? I mean, obviously the BDS movement is problematic for Israel, but even those who either support maybe a partial boycott or just are liberal Jews are asking publicly, does this forestall me from taking my kids to Israel, which I do on a regular basis? I'm thinking of somebody like Peter Beinart, who's written about this extensively. He's also written a big piece in the New York Times supporting the boycott, one that is certainly...
Of settlements, I think, not of...
the boycott of settlements, exactly right. So he makes a distinction. Right. So what do you think of that? Does that make it harder?
Yeah. This isn't really a trick question, is it? It's
No,
deeply
it's not.
worrisome
Not a trick
to me.
question.
It's deeply worrisome to me when you talk about who is and isn't allowed into Israel based on their political view. Israel has every right to be a safe, secure, state and otherwise. But if you're suggesting that people are not allowed, or if the Israeli administration is making moves towards saying, that those visiting Israel are not allowed to have the same discourse as Israelis do, and if there are limitations on what public discourse can and can't be in Israel, and there are other elements on the press and otherwise that are of deep concern to me as an American Jew and as a lover of Israel, on Israel's, where Israel is as being able to hold itself as a Jewish and democratic state. So I think these are very worrisome trends right now.
I have my doubts as to how fervently that law will be implemented. I have my doubts whether the Supreme Court will uphold it. I think it's more of a political statement expressing what is a widely held sense of revulsion against BDS, and we would probably share that. But that Israel is it's still a democracy. It still has checks and balances. It still has a freewheeling press and a raucous political debate and independent judiciary that frequently these somewhat extreme sounding and very political proposals arise, and then they get either very watered down or they get dismissed altogether. So I'm hopeful that this will kind of fall into that category. Not that I'm an advocate in any way for BDS, but because I think the issues you raised about open discourse are important, and I think they're important to a large number of Israelis.
Okay, I think we're going to open up to the audience now. So again, as Ellen indicated, I'm going to repeat. We're looking for brief questions, and we have two people walking around with the mic, so just raise your hand if you have a question.
And I have a question about responding to your daughter asking about Palestinians not being able to vote in Israel.
No,
and
no,
apartheid.
in the territories.
Okay, but now who voted for Abbas 12 years ago for his 4-year term? Weren't Palestinians allowed to vote there?
That would have been helpful for me to say, but so the question is, at what point do you define self-determination, a state, a two-state solution, and otherwise? What rights and need to be extended to a people, Palestinians or any other people, at which point that they can actually say, freedom of movement, of policing, of otherwise. Are the Palestinians right now, would you think, in a position of being their own state, their own people?
Now, those in Israel, if they're citizens, that they can vote in Israel and they're Arab members in the Knesset, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
so
Right.
thank
Correct.
you.
So two very different.
Two very different sets, but these are questions that very prominent Israelis are asking. The same question your daughter asked. And when I say very prominent Israelis, I'm talking about former chiefs of staff of the IDF. If you talk to them privately, I'm talking about current members of the general staff of the IDF. I'm talking about Shin Bet directors. These are not questions that are only being asked by people at the margins. These are being asked by truly deeply committed Zionist patriotic Israelis who wonder at what point, when you don't have an ability to separate Israelis and Palestinians on the West Bank, Israel's own definition as Jewish and democratic begins to change.
So my question is, what can Israeli government do? What can the American Jewish community do to make a closer feeling between Israelis and American Jews?
You know what, I forgot, I'm supposed to be repeating the question for filming purposes. And so the question was, what can the Israeli government and the Israelis do to make Israelis closer to American Jews? Because they don't care.
Look, I think these mutual educational efforts are the only recipe that helps solve that. It's obviously getting Israelis exposed to the diversity of life in diversity of American Jewish life, and understanding the support they get from that and the friendship, but that hopefully it goes deeper than that. Hopefully it has to do with a shared destiny of a Jewish people, both within and without the state of Israel. And we know, I think, the challenges we face on getting our own, we've discussed it, our own youth educated to have those connections with a broad diversity of Israeli society. But it's not, look, it's not something that comes easily. We live very different lives. We live very different realities. And I don't think it's something that we should be surprised at, that there is that gulf of perspectives. And what I think we need to work very hard on is to prevent that getting wider. But there is something natural about it, given the different experiences we live with and the way we raise our children.
So the question is whether, in the same way that the Orthodox are in control of a lot of society in Israel, whether we are in danger of that happening in America.
Right. Please God, no. Israel's based, and this is about Israel, it's about the origins of the Israeli chief rabbinate, of a centralized system of religious authority and a close inbreeding of religion and state, both of which would be an anathema to the American sensibility, a Jeffersonian notion of everyone being able to express their religion as they so please, and without a centralized authority. So I don't feel that that's a fear here. I do think, and just to answer a different question, but I have the mic, which is the importance of American Jews living vibrant American Jewish lives. Now, of course, a rabbi is going to say that, but I think that the greatest threat to, maybe not the greatest, but one of the greatest threats to the relationship between American Jewry and Israel is an American Jewry that no longer cares. And in the studies that have been done, and I'm not making a different point here, but hopefully you'll follow my logic, that the strength of a Zionism in a household is directly connected to the strength of the Judaism in that household, and the threat of to that is a threat to the relationship. So live a vibrant Jewish life and give the Israelis positive models of what it means to be a Reformed Jew, a conservative Jew, or otherwise, and then they'll start paying attention. But if we're weak, then why should they care?
Thank you both for really a very stimulating conversation that clearly has to just be the beginning and not the end. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.